At the beginning of a relationship, there is a lot of sexual attraction, and that's usually what draws people together. But as a relationship develops and as it deepens, intimacy occurs on an emotional level, and it's actually the emotional connection that ends up then driving the physical connection in.
Hey friend, welcome to Java with Juli. I'm Juli Slattery. This podcast is an outreach of authentic intimacy. In today's conversation, we're going to be talking about something that very quietly shapes every relationship you've ever had, whether you realize it or not. It's the lens through which you view conflict, the way you respond to intimacy, and even how you experience attraction. We are talking about attachment styles. My guest today is Marc Cameron, who has spent years helping people understand how their earliest relationships form a blueprint of how they connect to other people in adulthood. And today we're not just going to be talking about theory. We're going to be getting into the real-life applications of attachment styles in dating, marriage, and even in sexual intimacy. So if you've ever wondered why you pull away when relationships get too close, or maybe why you're always overthinking or overgiving or constantly stuck in unhealthy patterns, this conversation is going to help you sort that out. Whether you are single, dating, married, or maybe somewhere in between, this is a conversation that can help you understand not just how you relate to others, but why. So let's head to the coffee shop for my conversation with Marc Cameron. Well, Marc, thanks so much for being willing to come on here and dig into this whole topic of attachment styles and romance and how this plays out in romantic and sexual relationships. So we've got quite a feat ahead of us.
Thanks for having me on. I am excited to be here.
Good. Yeah. So we've done a podcast before with Mylan and Kay, who you have taken over for their whole work in terms of how we love an attachment style. And we're going to link to that conversation that I had with them. I think it was about 2 years ago. If people want to get some more basics on what we're even talking about with this idea of attachment style. But I would love to start just even a few minutes fly over. What are attachment styles? Why is it important that we know them?
Yeah, so everybody has an attachment style, whether they know it or not. And attachment is basically relationship programming. Mm-hmm. So everything that we know, we have learned, and everything that we've learned, we've had a teacher for. So what we know about relationships and how to go about expressing our needs and getting our needs met, we've learned from our first teachers, which are families of origin. And so 80 years of research shows that the bond between a parent and child should go a specific way for it to be healthy development. And when it doesn't go that way, the research shows us that we develop particular insecurities in the way that we relate. And there's identified attachment styles. Mm-hmm. And there's only one secure one, and there's several insecure ones.
So what are they? What are the insecure ones?
So the insecure ones are, and I'm going to use different language because the traditional language are dismissive, avoidant, anxious, ambivalent, preoccupied, and disorganized. And I'm going to use the terms from Mylan and Kay's book, How We Love. Mm-hmm. And so the different ones are an emotional avoider, a people pleaser, a vacillator who is basically a relationship idealist that bounces back and forth between what they want. And then there's somebody who can be more of a controller, or someone who can be more victim. Mm-hmm. And those two grow up in the same home, which is called disorganized attachment. And usually that home is dangerous.
Okay. So, really, does anybody have a truly secure attachment coming out of childhood? At some level, do all of us have some insecurities and just it's a matter of extremes or a scale? Or are there some people that genuinely have that secure attachment coming out of their childhood home?
Yeah, it's both. So attachment is rated on a spectrum. So we can be mildly, moderately, or very much like any one of these styles. But we all have insecurities because there's no perfect parents out there. So therefore, there's no perfect children out there. And so we get things wrong. But all secure attachment is that for the majority of the time, the parent can pick up on the child's emotional state, invite them into a conversation, explore that their emotions, give them language, empathize, validate, listen, hear them out, and then meet the corresponding emotional need. And if that happens more often than not, then that's what the child learns for their relational programming. Yeah. But I often say this to people, if I'm 51% of the way somewhere, then I still got a long way to go, right? Almost halfway. So we can continually grow. We can continually become more secure, but there's no one who is 100% secure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, our attachment style plays out in all of our relationships, including friendships and work, but we're going to zero in specifically on romantic attachment, and that can include how we approach dating, how we approach sexuality, how we approach marriage. And my guess would be that that's where these attachment styles are going to be most evident, because it's often the deepest invitation to vulnerability and intimacy. Is that a correct assumption?
You're 100% correct. Exactly. Yeah. The people who we attach strongest to, or we want to attach strongest to, that's where these strategies display most. So typically under pressure, or it could be in the romance phase of a relationship too.
How about dating? So if you were to talk about insecure attachment styles and ones that you've mentioned, how might that play out in dating relationships, or even a desire not to date?
Yeah. So can I give a brief overview of each of the attachment styles?
Great.
So I mentioned the names, please. But I think if I give a brief overview, people will get more of a concept for it. So avoidant attachment occurs when there's not a lot of talk about emotions and feelings in a family. So growing up, this kid might fall over and hurt themselves and start to cry, and they'll get a message of like, come on, you're okay. Just, don't cry, or there's no monsters under the bed. Nothing to be scared of, go to sleep. And so really what happens for this kid is that when they have these natural emotional expressions, it gets dismissed by this parent or a parent. And so they learn to turn the volume down on their emotions because they're told you're overfeeling. That's the message that they receive. And typically in this home, or from this particular parent who's more avoidant, it's more task-oriented, and achievement-oriented. So academics, athletics, getting stuff done, and that's how they get their attaboys or attagirls. And so this kid goes into adulthood with the volume turned down on their emotions because they push them aside just to move on. And they usually are very achievement-focused. And so they're attractive to other people because they're high performers usually. Mm-hmm. And now to address romantic relationships, most romantic relationships start off the same way, where there's this idealization phase, and it's the sexual connection or the attraction that drives the relationship, and we view one another through this more idealistic lens. But then, over time, real life sets in, and two people will vie for their own needs, and then that's where conflict occurs. And for the avoider, they are more problem solvers. They just want to fix things because that's what they do for themselves. They just push past and what's the solution. If that doesn't work, then they're more avoidant. They distance, they run away, and they think, the other person will get over it and they'll move on because that's exactly what I do. So they end up avoiding difficult conversations. Yeah. So that's avoidant attachment. And then there's anxious attachment. People probably heard of avoidant attachment and anxious attachment, but within anxious attachment, there's two styles. There's the people pleaser, and the pleaser grows up in a home where they learn to manage their parents' emotions. They have a parent who's angry and the anger scares them, or they have a parent who's very critical or anxious and worried or depressed. And so they become the good kid because they regulate their parent to calm the anxiety in them. And they grow up going to adulthood, and they are usually just very giving because they give and please and appease to calm other people down. And so they're attracted to others because they're very easygoing and they seem like but when it comes to conflict for them, they give in and they can just really lose themselves. Healthy relationships have balance, and they're more comfortable in the giver role than the receiver role. Please and appease. And they can become codependents. And then the other anxious attachment style is the vacillator. The vacillator grows up in a home where there's inconsistent connection. So they get some connection they enjoy, and then they're made to wait on it. And that could be because the parent's mood, or it could be a custody situation or a parent's job. And they learn to protest. They act out their feelings. and they want the parent to pick up on what's going on the inside of them and resolve it. And either that parent is not emotionally intelligent enough to do that, or they can't change their circumstance. And so this kid goes into adulthood with their longing for connection turned on high. And in the relationship stage, the dating stage, they love that because it's all about time, attention, and connection, all the things that they missed out on growing up. And so to idealize other people and bond too quickly to others. And then when real life sets in, they do what they learn to do. They sulk, they pout, they outburst to try and get the other person to meet their needs. But their protest is typically hurtful and unkind. And then they can sabotage efforts. And then the last two, the controller and the victim, I talked about these two grow up in a home where it's disorganized, it's chaotic, it's typically dangerous, there's abuse or neglect. And they go one of two ways. They can become a controller or a victim. And not everybody who grows up in an abusive home becomes a controller or a victim. You can either learn a mix of the attachment styles. But if abusive is pervasive, these kids learn that relationships are a one up, one down position. Someone's in control and somebody receives. And the more feisty kid fights back and they go into the controller position, and the kid who's more passive goes into the victim position. And they often end up finding one another in adulthood and end up in the cycle of abuse.
Wow. That's a lot. And I think everybody listening is trying to figure out, which one am I? How do my insecurities play into this? What happened to me in childhood that would kind of set me up for that? And I wonder if you could even just level set a little bit. I think people might feel when they hear that these attachment styles are determinative. In other words, you only get one shot at childhood. You only get one set of parents. You can't go back and redo it. So if we have one of these attachment styles, how do we fight that sense of, I guess I'll just never have healthy relationships?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And this is actually the good news of attachment research. So attachment is how we are. It's not who we are. Meaning that part of us can be changed. There's parts of us that can't be changed. If we're an introvert or an extrovert, we're just born that way. You're not going to be able to change that because that's about how you gain energy. But attachment is about how you attach to other people, how you express your needs, what your expectations are. And the good news about attachment research is that we can earn a secure attachment style in adulthood. But we have to first become aware of what our attachment style is and then work specific goals, growth goals for each attachment style to kind of lean the opposite way and work yourself out of those insecurities. And our brains remain neuroplastic for our entire lives, meaning that we can continually change and form our neural pathways. And if you want to mirror that to the process of sanctification in Christianity, right? Yes, our sins are washed away as soon as we confess and accept Christ into our heart, but our history of experiences aren't washed away. Those don't become new. And so as we learn to become like Christ, we get sanctified and we change and we grow.
That's the good news. The question is, how do we begin to do that? Let's take, for example, somebody with that more avoidant attachment style who, gets in relationships and immediately is idealistic about it, and that conflict comes up and they don't want to deal with their emotions or the other person's emotions. And so they find themselves, constantly in relationships that end. And they don't know why that happens. What is a step that they can actually take to begin the work of rewiring their attachment style in their brain?
Yeah. So once avoiders become aware that this is an attachment style and that it can be changed, first of all, they got to want to change, because I think that's the biggest challenge for avoidant attachment style, is that it continues to serve a purpose for them in areas of life, typically, because it helps them move past things and push on. And usually that makes them successful in work, and they get a lot of attaboys for that. Plus, generally, people don't like to feel negative feelings. So avoiders have got to be convinced of, if I need to feel my emotions, then that means I got to feel sad. I've got to feel overwhelmed at times. I got to feel fearful. But once you can realize that the definition of empathy is I know what it feels like for another because I know what it feels like for me. But if I don't know that, then I can't connect with another person. And that's how connection happens. It happens through the emotional. And so when you realize that you're limiting connection by not being able to experience your emotions, that's the challenge. And so the challenge is typically they need a list of emotions to be able to look at and to learn to sit and feel it. And that can be quite uncomfortable for them to do. But as you learn to do that, a softening happens on the inside. And you realize that your relationships become deeper and more fulfilling as you learn to do that.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that same sort of thing goes with any attachment style that we want to grow out of. It's about awareness, like facing it, and then stepping into the challenge, and probably getting a coach or a therapist that would help us take steps into what does healthy relationship look like.
Exactly. And so the research shows us that it uses this language that we earn a secure attachment style by first building a coherent narrative, which is really coherent is something makes sense. Narrative is story. So by making sense of our childhood story, by understanding how we got shaped a certain way, and being able to put language and words and story to feeling emotion states. Because in the brain, those are held in two different areas. Language and feelings are held in two different areas. And so in order to be able to connect those, if we can put story to them, our brain starts to integrate. And then we can realize why we might be reacting in a certain way. And then that's the flag for us to lean the opposite way. So each of the attachment styles have to learn to lean the opposite way. A pleaser needs to learn to speak up because they're typically fearful of conflict. A vacillator needs to learn to pull back because they typically go to fight. They're going to tell you, they're going to criticize, they're going to complain, but they need to learn to listen more. So we're all trying to get to the same place, secure attachment, but the path there is different for each of them, depending upon what their insecure propensities are.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of research and a lot of advice, and you've written and others have written on, again, how this plays out in intimate relationships. And when we look at the research on how many people are not in intimate relationships, whether it's that they've never been married or they're divorced, they've kind of given up on that thought. That's why I think it's really important for us to talk about not just how this plays out in intimate relationships, but how it might be sabotaging even the formation of an intimate relationship. And I don't know if there's research on that or if you've addressed that in your own practice.
Yeah, there is. And so people who are more avoidantly attached, their relationships stay like this. They don't get close like this. They stay like this. Yeah. And so when they can often get frightened off, so to speak, even though they might not know, they might not put words to it that way or acknowledge that they're fearful, but they can often push away when the relationship reaches that deeper stage of wanting to connect because they feel uncomfortable, they feel vulnerable. They feel incompetent, relationally incompetent, and they don't know what to do. So they can often sabotage by pulling away. And eventually the other person, after a while may end up disconnecting. And so they can have trouble entering into longer term commitments with other people. Whereas somebody who's more of a pleaser can be very anxious and they can become very codependent quickly in relationships, which is not good either.
Yeah.
When they're bonding anxiously and bonding insecurely. Yeah. And so they can end up in relationships that are harmful or unbalanced and not make a good choice in picking a spouse.
Now, you're aware of a lot of what the work we do here at Authentic Intimacy is around sexuality. And when we were emailing back and forth about this conversation, you made the suggestion, I'd love to share about how this plays out in sexuality. I don't think I've ever thought about the application of attachment style to sexuality and to sexual intimacy in a relationship. So what even kind of clued you into the fact that there's an overlap?
Well, Mylan and Kay have been talking about this for years. And so really it's been listening and learning from them. They actually have a workshop that they do called How We Love Sex or Don't. Yeah. And it's all about attachment styles and how that impacts our sexual drive and our arousal and our sexual connection. and how that limits and sabotages in this way. And a lot of people want to attribute problems to a male-female difference. And there are significant male-female differences. But oftentimes what people are experiencing is not a male-female difference. It's an attachment style insecurity.
Maybe you could use an example, like take two different attachment styles, they're together. How does this play out in their sexual relationship?
Yeah, so the most common pairing that will enter therapy would be somebody who's an avoidant and somebody who's a vacillator. So the vacillator is attracted to the avoider because they're consistent. All of the things that they missed out in childhood, which their wound comes from this inconsistency. And so the avoider is usually Mr. or Mrs. Consistent, they're high performing, they're attractive. And then for the avoider, they're attracted to the vacillator because the vacillator idealizes. They build this image in their mind of who this person is, and they're all in. And they're sharing so much, and they want to be physically connected. And for somebody who's avoidant, especially avoidant male, that touch feels amazing. Well, no one's ever really paid this much attention to me before, and I like the sexual touch. I like that physical connection because I'm attracted to this other person. And so that's how the attraction happens. But attachment style also affects our approach to intimacy, our approach to sex. And so, and there's a difference here between avoidant males and avoidant females. And so avoidant males often take a non-relational approach to sex. So it's really all about the feeling or the orgasm that they can achieve. And so it's more of a non-relational event. Yeah. They may not make eye contact. They may not say tender words. There may not be a lot of hugging or holding. They just want the feel-good factor of it. And whereas avoidant females, what I find is they can have an aversion to sex. It does it, I've heard avoidant females say, I hate sex. I don't like it. It doesn't feel good. I don't really want it. And so they can push away in that sense.
Yeah. I just wonder when you're talking about avoidant males, if like the physical connection of sex is almost used as the closeness that they don't know how to get or they're afraid of emotionally. So, at one level, it is relational because it's like, this is the closest I can get to feeling connected to you, but I can't explore anything beyond what our bodies are doing. Is that a fair summation?
That is a very fair summation. But in the beginning of a relationship, there is a lot of sexual attraction, and that's usually what draws people together. But as a relationship develops and as it deepens, intimacy occurs on an emotional level. And it's actually the emotional connection that ends up then driving the physical connection. It ends up flipping. At first, it's the sexual connection, the sexual attraction that drives the emotional connection. Like, you're attractive, you look good to me, I want to get to know you. But later on, it flips. And it's the depth of intimacy that actually then draws a person to want to bond and be physically close to another person. And because the avoider, especially an avoider man, they don't get close, that can sabotage then the desire from their spouse to want to be close to them. Because their spouse is not feeling this emotional connection, this depth, this intimacy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hey friend, Juli here. I just want to pause for a minute and share something with you. If you regularly listen to Job with Juli, you may have noticed that we don't have ads on this podcast. And that is on purpose, because I want this to be a space where we can talk very openly and safely about God and sexuality without distraction. But that also means that this podcast is supported by listeners like you. At Authentic Intimacy, we're seeing just how much these conversations are needed. So many people are looking for clarity and hope and a place just to talk about these difficult topics through a biblical lens. If this podcast has meant something to you, would you consider partnering with us as a monthly donor? Your support helps us continue creating content like this, and reach even more people who are searching for truth and for healing. As a small thank you, I'd love to send you a copy of my newly updated book, 25 Questions You're Afraid to Ask About Love, Sex, and Intimacy. You can become a monthly partner at AuthenticIntimacy.com/give, or just check out the link in the show notes. Thanks so much for being part of this community. Now back to my conversation with Marc Cameron. Then I want to follow up with what you said about the avoidant female. You said a lot of them don't want sex at all. They don't enjoy it. I want to clarify that there can be women of many different attachment styles that have an issue with sex that might be physical pain or abuse from the past. And so it's not always because of an avoidant attachment style. But that's interesting that you would say, like you've seen a pattern that a lot of time the wife or the female who's avoidant just wants to avoid all contact like that.
Correct. Yes, I'm speaking, I would clarify that too. I'm speaking in generalities here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm speaking through the attachment lens, but you're right. There are other factors at play that can cause somebody to have an aversion to sex or sexual contact.
Okay. How about the people pleaser? How does that show up in a sexual relationship?
Yeah. So for a people pleaser, they are proximity seekers, meaning that their anxiety level goes down when they feel close to another person. And so having sex or being physically close and touch for them means this person's happy with me, they're okay with me, they're accepting of me, and there's no conflict happening between us. So oftentimes that can be the motivation behind initiating a sexual experience or contact in that moment. It's to reduce their own anxiety. And the difference between what I find between males and females is that females can give in and do things that they're not actually comfortable with.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to speak up and they don't want to upset their husband. Or if their husband feels like they've held out too long, they can have fear of upsetting them in a certain way. And so for them, it could be, doing their quote unquote wifely duty.
Yeah.
I'm going to do this, I'm going to give in. And they may do things that they're actually uncomfortable doing. They may have pain and they may not voice that. Because they want their husband to be happy with them. And what I find with a male pleaser is I've seen male pleasers go for years, sometimes for decades in a sexless marriage and not say anything. Because they don't want to upset the apple cart, even though they have a physical drive that is going unmet. They don't want to cause conflict in the relationship. So they're not happy about it. They'll manage it somehow.
Yeah. If it seems like in a lot of Christian settings that people pleaser pattern is actually encouraged and rewarded. In, Christian settings, we talk all the time about wanting to serve the other spouse, whether it's the female being concerned about her husband and wanting to please him. And women are encouraged to do that all the time. And men might be encouraged, hey, to be Christ-like means you put your spouse first, like if she's not interested or she doesn't want to have sex, like don't push it. Like you're being a servant. You're being like Christ by not voicing what you desire. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think avoidant attachment styles and pleaser attachment styles are often reinforced from the church. I went to church a few weeks ago, and the pastor was preaching on the Beatitudes, and particularly on do not worry. And really the overall message was, and he actually said this at the end, husbands, if your wife is worrying about something, basically just tell her not to worry. God has overcome. And wives, if your husband has said this, give the same message. But I don't believe that God's word actually contradicts his design. There's a specific design for us on how our brains work and how we're designed to attach. Researchers have observed this for 80 years, that healthy connection happens in a certain way. And so when we minimize what we're feeling on the inside, or we minimize what someone else is feeling on the inside, we're limiting actually knowing the other person, which is where emotional connection happens. And when we do these How We Love workshops and we explain these styles, we often compare them to Jesus. And we ask the question, was Jesus an emotional avoider? Was he incompassionate? No, that's not true. He cried with Mary and Martha when Lazarus died. He was a very compassionate person. Was Jesus a people pleaser? No, he allowed the rich young ruler to walk away from him. He actually stood up very forcefully at times to the Pharisees. And so, yes, we do want to learn how to serve one another, but we also want to learn how do we get to know one another in the Lord's design and be able to create open, honest dialogue where we can hear the hurt inside another person and learn to connect and empathize with that. And I think people miss this fact. Oftentimes people think that connection happens in the positive. That's how we get close. And you watch shows like The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, and what do? They fly all around the world and they have these unrivaled dates on these amazing places, and it's all about exhilaration. Mm-hmm. But the retainment rate of people who get married on that show is 17%.
I'm surprised it's that high.
It's very low. Exactly. It's very low. So it just shows that, having all of these euphoric experiences is not the formula for relationship success. Actually, deeper emotional connection happens in, what we might call negative emotions. Mm-hmm. When you sit with someone who is hurting and you cry with them. When somebody who is fearful and you're able to offer protection for them or presence for them, that's how emotional connection happens.
Yeah. And I've seen that happen in couples in the sexual realm when they will go through something difficult, like addressing a pornography issue or years of infertility, or, one spouse has a history of abuse and the other spouse is with them in it, in the healing process and the grieving process, that the level of intimacy that a couple like that develops in sort of the valley of difficulty is greater than the couple who's like, no, this has always been easy for us. Like, we just have always connected. So I think what you're saying there is really key, even though none of us wishes for those kinds of situations to walk through together.
Exactly. But vulnerability breeds vulnerability. And if we acknowledge reality is that we all experience the full spectrum of emotions. Mm-hmm. We have, just for categorization purposes, we have categorized emotions into positive and negative to explain key differences between two types. But by categorizing a group of emotions as negative, it's primed people's thinking that, oh, well, that's negative. We got to get away from that.
Yeah.
But that's not so. We're made in God's image, and God feels grieved. God feels jealous. God feels sad. God feels angry. He feels these emotions, and he's designed us to feel these emotions too. And so being able to acknowledge that in someone else actually allows, and lean in, allows me to get to know that person. And that's where intimacy develops. Oftentimes, and I'll hear this in therapy, especially among Christians, people won't, it's like they don't like to say the word sex because it's taboo. So they'll say intimacy. Mm-hmm. Oh, we had intimacy last night. We haven't had intimacy in a long time. And then that primes them to think, well, the sexual connection is intimacy.
Yeah.
Sexual connection can be intimate, but it might not be intimate.
Right.
If you go and visit a prostitute, that's a non-relational event. There's not really intimacy that's occurring between two people, but a sexual connection, a sexual experience happens. Mm-hmm. So intimacy is when it's whole person. And that's why God has designed us this way, that we come together through the physical attraction and then later on it flips. And that's where a lot of couples then start to struggle, because then they will say, well, it used to be so easy. Mm-hmm. What's happened? Mm-hmm. The natural life cycle of the relationship has happened.
Yeah.
And you haven't understood it, and you've defaulted to these reactionary strategies formed from your insecurities.
Mm-hmm. So I would love for you to give advice to, say, for example, that guy who's the people pleaser. And you said you've met husbands in that situation who have gone 6 months or years without any sexual connection with their wife. And they just have sort of resigned themselves that, this is how I love my wife. I'm not going to speak up. I just really want that connection emotionally, and it's not worth going through the conflict. What advice do you have for him?
Yeah, well, sex is a couple's problem. Oftentimes, especially men can see their wives as a gatekeeper to sex because women typically don't have a biological build. Men have a biological build that needs a release. Okay, it's not a survival level need that I'm going to die.
Yeah.
But it does need to get released somehow. And if it doesn't get released through masturbation or through sex, it comes out in nocturnal emission. But it comes out somehow. And because wives don't have that buildup that a man has, a man often sees their wife as the gatekeeper. Whereas oftentimes wives are seeing their husband as the gatekeeper that, you don't want to invest in me in this relationship. You don't want to connect with me emotionally. You just want to have a non-relational event. Well, I don't want that. And so then that doesn't drive, that holds them back. It doesn't drive them toward that sexual connection. So sex is a couple's problem. And so it needs to be addressed in that way. In fact, I'm on a national call-in radio show called New Life Live, where people call in with their problems. And just this week, a man called in and he said he was a virgin when he got married, and he's been married to his wife for 40 years. And she told him on their wedding night that she doesn't like sex. And so they haven't had sex in 40 years.
Wow.
And he came to he just did not know what to do.
Yeah.
And so my advice to him is that this needs to be addressed. You need to learn how to speak up, how to lean in, you might have to draw certain boundaries, not in a pouting way, not in a protest way, like I'm mad at you, so I'm holding back here. But God has designed us as sexual beings, and sex is an important component for a marriage to actually survive. Of course, marriages, things can happen between two people and trauma can happen or medical conditions can happen. But to start beginning a relationship where there's no sexual component is very difficult for a marriage to survive that. And so lean in and address that openly and honestly.
How? They're like, okay, if I haven't been able to do it in 40 years, how am I going to do that now? Give me the words.
I'll give you the words. And this is something that some people might feel a little bit of resistance to.
Okay.
And I totally get that and I totally understand that. But on the show, we often guide people toward something called a scaffolded separation. When somebody is not engaging in the marital relationship in a healthy, loving, comforting, secure way. They're just not acknowledging someone else's sexual need, is really just kind of dismissing, a key component of how they're designed. And so that's where you might have to do a scaffolded separation. You might have to say to somebody, hey, this is so hurtful that you won't engage in this conversation. And in order for me to be emotionally connected to you, if that's going to drive a physical desire for me and that's going to go unmet, that becomes so hurtful. So I'm going to have to pull back. I'm going to have to limit some of my emotional connection, not because I want to limit my emotional connection. I want to have emotional connection with you, but because it leads to disappointment that you won't acknowledge this desire or seek health and improvement, I may have to pull back in that.
Yeah.
So I want to have this discussion with you. Please let me know when you're willing to have that or when you're willing for us to both seek support. I'm here.
And I think it's so important. What I didn't hear you say is because you won't have sex with me. You use terms like because you won't have this conversation, because you're unwilling to acknowledge as part of our relationship. You don't want to go get help. You don't want to work towards sexual connection. And I think there's a big difference between that and some of the conversations that couples can have where it's all about the physical act because you won't do this physical act. And I've been in this field long enough to know that the person who does not want sex has a reason why. It may have nothing to do with the marriage. It might have to do with something that happened to them in the past, or it may have to do with the marriage and conflict that's not resolved, or it might be an attachment style. So the win is not that, okay, you agree to do this with me or for me, but that you agree to have the conversation and work towards healing at some level.
Yeah, and it works both ways. And as you mentioned earlier on, sometimes it's sexual trauma. Mm-hmm. And, and again, I'm speaking male, female here. For a husband to say, well, that's your hang up. That wasn't me who did that to you. You got to go to therapy and you got to fix that.
Yeah.
Well, when we marry someone, we marry their whole history of experiences. Mm-hmm. And our brains work by developing neural pathways and shortcuts. Yeah. And so if we developed trauma association to sex, it doesn't matter if the husband was not the person who was the perpetrator. Mm. That pathway is there. And so the husband, the spouse, can actually help with the healing of the other person by learning to lean in and be tender and be gentle and go slow and be respectful of boundaries. Mm-hmm.
If we've hit a nerve for a listener today and they're like, wow, you're describing my relationship. I need help. Like, I want more of this. I know you have a book, Understanding Your Attachment Style. We will link to that in our show notes. But what other step would you encourage that individual or couple to take?
Yeah, I think you can't change something that you're not aware of. Okay, and so to become aware that we all have an attachment style, and that is probably the number one predictor of how our relationships go. Mm-hmm. So to become, in my book, I have it's divided into 3 sections. It's gain insight. So what is attachment? And then it's become aware. How has attachment impacted me? And then it's show up to practice. I mean, we all know that diet and exercise leads to physical health. And a lot of people sign up for the gym come January 1st, but how many people actually follow through? Mm-hmm. Well, because it gets too hard and it's easier to default back to how what we know. But there's pain involved both ways. There's the pain of growth or there's the pain of staying stuck. And so once, hopefully people are becoming more aware now that they have an attachment style, because everybody does. Mm-hmm. Research shows us that. Identifying what your attachment style is and leaning into the ways to become more secure is what is going to help you grow. Here's the relationship math. It takes 2 secure attachment styles to have a securely attached relationship. You can't take 2 insecure attachment styles and put them together and expect that there's not going to be any problems, because insecure attachments attach insecurely by definition. Mm. And so if you remain a pleaser or a vacillator or a controller or a victim, expect to have the problems that pleasers, vacillators, controllers, and victims have in terms of attachment. So, but when 2 people can acknowledge how they have been shaped and how that impacts the other person and reminds the other person of their attachment wounds, they can learn to heal together. And in Mylan and Kay's book, How We Love, they talk about something called the comfort circle, which is a structured listening exercise that 2 people can engage in to develop this greater insight and awareness and learn how to recondition and develop true intimacy with one another.
Well, there certainly is a lot to process in that conversation. I think all of us can hear parts of our own story in what he shared. I know I can. But I hope that one thing that you're definitely taking away is that your attachment style isn't your destiny. It's a pattern, but it's a pattern that can change. You're not stuck, but you do have to start by becoming aware of what's driving you. So maybe a next step for you is just to get curious, to ask, how do I show up in relationships? And do I pull back? Do I overextend? Do I always try to avoid conflict, or maybe do I run towards it? And if you are in a relationship, what would it look like to start a conversation, not to just fix things overnight, but to learn and be honest about what you're learning about yourself and the person you're attached to? We're going to link to Marc's new book called Understanding Your Attachment Style, which might be a great resource for you and a significant other to read through together. and also the episode with Kay and Milan Yurkovich that I mentioned in the show. And as always, you're going to find more resources like books and Q&A videos and podcast episodes like this one at our website, AuthenticIntimacy.com. But for now, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time for more Java with Juli.